Welcome to episode 326 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent on a mission to show you who the FBI is and what the FBI does through my books, my blog, and my podcast case reviews with former colleagues. Today, we get to speak to retired agent Vito Roselli, who served in the FBI for 26 years. In this episode, Vito reviews his investigation of a bank robbery conspiracy operated by a violent West Philadelphia crew whose members were responsible for bank robberies in Pennsylvania and South Jersey and the vicious assault of an elderly couple. One of Vito's subjects, Chris Booker, who was convicted of multiple violations, including bank robbery conspiracy and murder, also takes part in this case review. Vito was assigned to the Philadelphia division, where he worked violent crimes and fugitives as a case agent for over 19 years and as a program manager and supervisor for 7 years. During his career, Vito dismantled drug gangs with international ties and some of the most violent bank robbery crews in the Northeast region. As a SWAT operator, Vito was deployed to national and international hotspots, engaging in high-risk arrest operations, including the counterterrorism mission following the 9/11 attacks. Vito twice deployed to the Iraqi war zone in 2006 and 2008, where he embedded with the Joint Special Operations Command. His interview and intelligence gathering skills contributed to the destruction of the world's most dangerous terror cells. As a manager and leader, Vito mentored hundreds of squad mates and subordinates and represented the FBI to foreign security agencies, law enforcement departments nationwide, and the private sector. Based on his expertise, he was called in for critical incidents at the FBI's National Command Center, spearheading high-priority operations. After his retirement, Vito moved to Southeast Florida and is working in the cybersecurity field for Restaurant Brands International. Chris Booker won an appeal of his conviction and was released from prison in 2021. He is currently a truck driver with his CDL and the author of over 40 urban crime novels. Now, before we get to the case review, I want to tell you about a new podcast that Vito Roselli is prominently featured. On There and Gone, South Street, he reviews the biggest unsolved case of his FBI career. The podcast covers the disappearance of Danielle Imbo and Richard Patrone, who were last seen leaving a bar in Philadelphia, never to be seen again. Nearly 2 decades later, they have never been found. This is a detailed and thorough look at the case from all points of view. And there's also a few sound bites from me about the media coverage of this case. One more thing. As you are aware, this podcast is apolitical and nonpartisan. There should be no political ads running on FBI Retired Case File Review. If you hear any, please let me know ASAP. In your podcast app's description of this episode, you'll find links to where you can join my reader team to keep up with the FBI and books, TV, and movies, buy me a cup of coffee, and learn more about me and my nonfiction book, FBI Myths and Misconceptions, and my 2 FBI crime novels, Pay to Play and Greedy Givers, all available as ebooks and paperbacks wherever books are sold, and audiobooks on Audible and Spotify. Thank you for your support. Now here's the show. I want to welcome my guest, retired agent Vito Roselli and Chris Booker. Hey guys, how are you?
Good. And yourself?
I'm doing great. How about you, Vito?
Doing good, Jerry. Thanks for the opportunity.
Well, this is really an opportunity for me because most of the time I am talking just to the FBI agent who investigated a case. But in this case, we are going to have an opportunity to actually speak with one of your subjects. Vito and I have known each other for a very long time. working together in the Philadelphia office. For some reason, I gravitated to, at the time was called Squad 10, which was the violent crime and bank robbery squad. So I hung around that squad and the people on that squad quite a bit. You then also transferred over to our Cherry Hill office, which is in New Jersey, but is also out of the Philadelphia division covering Gloucester, Camden, and Salem County. Did this case occur when you were out there, or was this a Philadelphia case?
So this was a Philadelphia case when I was still assigned over in Philly to Squad 10.
Okay. What we're going to do today is to talk about one of Vito's cases that ended up with Chris going to prison, but it's also just a great opportunity for us to talk and to get to know how somebody ends up on the other side of the law. And in Chris's case, how they make it to the other side. I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about who Chris is. So, Vito, why don't you introduce him a little bit and then we'll let Chris tell us his story also.
I was investigating a series of bank robberies over in southeast Pennsylvania. And in the process, I learned about a murder that happened out in Darby, a drug-related murder. I had no idea it was related to my bank robbery investigations, but I had an informant who basically told me, hey, it's this guy, Chris Booker, and he's hiding in Atlantic City. So I reached out to a detective buddy of mine who was out in Darby. And I said, did you have a murder? He's like, yeah, broad daylight. Kid gets slumped and he's on the, on the sidewalk. So I said, well, it's this kid, Chris Booker from West Philly, and he's hiding out in Atlantic City. I'll let Chris take it from there because sure enough, he's out in Atlantic City. And coincidentally, he gets arrested with a couple of guns and the drugs. I'll let you jump in from there.
Yeah, I'm glad to be on this platform here, man. Something different for me. I appreciate the opportunity from both of you guys. Basically, man, I grew up in West Philadelphia, two-parent household, did good in school, got into some trouble as a juvenile, did a couple juvenile sentences and came home and, wanted to do good, but I got caught back into the streets and that was my life back then. At a corner of my own. At this time, I was on 55th Street. That was like the place to it be.
I'm going to have to interrupt you, Chris, because we have lots of people listening from really all over the world. And some of them might have caught a little bit of the language from a TV show or a movie, but you're going to have to explain some of the things that you're talking about. Something as simple as you had a corner. What does that mean?
Basically, I had my own piece of territory in Philadelphia. Like we don't, we're not really like gangs and stuff like that. But it's also is definitely territorial issues, street corners, 55th Street, 56th Street, things of that nature, like one street corner, which would be one block that you may have grew up on or you spent a lot of your street time on. That for me was 55th and Pemberton Street.
Hey, Jared, let me just jump in real quick. It's just pretty significant what he's saying, just so people understand the crime culture in Philadelphia. Unlike a lot of other big cities, Philadelphia had some pretty well-known violent neighborhood gangs. So all those national gangs like the Bloods and the Crips, they never got a foothold in Philadelphia because the neighborhood gangs, they ran the show in Philly. That's who that's the Philly, basically the crime underworld.
On a legal standpoint, it probably wouldn't be considered gangs. We just don't consider ourselves as gangs. We just kids from the neighborhood, So that's the only real difference, between the major gangs that's out there now and Philadelphia's what legal terms would consider as gangs. It's just different in the wording, but could be the same. It's definitely the same in the legal aspect.
And so this particular corner, was it yours or did you work for somebody or did you have a crew that kind of worked for you?
This was a corner that's basically been handed down from generation to generation from one old head and an old head is, an older person who may have had that corner at that specific time. He may have gotten locked up or gotten killed. So it would basically be handed down to the next person who steps up for the corner. It could be anybody, a younger guy, another older guy, whoever steps up and pretty much takes control of the corner is the person who's going to pretty much own the corner. So at that time, I stepped up, had a good friend of mine who was with me who also stepped up right beside me. And we had that corner, which was pretty much ours in a sense, until we get locked up, and then it just goes to the next person, whoever's maybe under us or another person who may want to step in and, try to take over the corner. One thing about it is, it has to be a certain level of respect, a certain level of violence that you're willing to put in for this corner in order to maintain it so others won't come in and try to take it. And that was something that I had to do at that time to, assure that that was known to be my block, my corner.
Of course, this is going to be a story of redemption. And we will talk about the fact that you turned, what's the word I want to use?
Turn your life around.
Let me help you because that's so cliche. Turning your life around, that's the basics. It's more of giving it up, is giving up the life, in order to recreate a different life for myself. It's deeper than just changing your life around, because people, they change their life around, but they still hold on to what they know best, which is the street life. But to completely let go is a different story in itself.
I get it. Yeah, I see what you're saying. At this time, you had been in and out of jail and prison?
Yeah, I did a few juvenile sentences, but nothing major. Year at one place, a year at this, and they was juveniles. I never did any serious adult time in the adult prison system until I was incarcerated, for the events that we're talking about now. A lot of cases were thrown out. Witnesses didn't show up, got thrown out, So, I beat a lot of cases.
And then at some point, your luck kind of ran out. And you were incarcerated initially on just a drug violation.
Right.
And was that state or federal?
This was a New Jersey state case in the beginning.
Are we talking about the one that Vito is going to talk about?
Right.
All right. Very good. Vito, tell us a little bit about bank robberies in Philadelphia and why you suggested that we include Chris in this case review.
Philadelphia is one of the major cities in the surrounding area. So Southeast Pennsylvania, South Jersey, Delaware. That region has been a hotspot for bank robberies, armed takeover bank robberies. It used to be next to Los Angeles. It was number 2 and number 3 year after year in the number of bank robberies and armored truck robberies. Bank robberies were pretty popular, unfortunately, in Philadelphia and the surrounding region. Going back in the 90s when I first started on the bank robbery squad, up through the first decade of 2000, you had some pretty significant armed robbery crews. I focus on West Philly. A lot of them seem to come out of the one particular area of West Philadelphia. But these crews were very aggressive, hitting banks, sometimes one a week. They used to also hit armored trucks going back into the early and mid 90s, but the older generation of these crews, we locked all of them up. Overall, Philadelphia, year after year, was second only to Los Angeles for the number of bank robberies in major cities. It was a significant problem. We had an entire squad that pretty much focused on these bank robbery crews. This particular investigation was kind of a continuation of those generational robbery crews from this West Philadelphia section. That's how I started focusing in on these bank robberies. They had a particular MO that matched what these other generations did, so I kind of knew where to start my investigation. So that's why I jumped in, became the case agent, and went on from there.
Tell us why you suggested that we include Chris in this case review.
Chris Booker came later on in the investigation and was a big part in taking down the final chapter of this organization, of this enterprise. He also provides a good perspective from how they planned and executed the bank robberies, the amount of effort and forethought that set this particular crew apart from others around the country. He presents that aspect. Also, he's not from that crew, so he brings another dynamic as to show Mr. Booker was He'll tell you he was one of the wild cards out in West Philly, a violent dude. It just kind of emphasizes the fact that these armed robbery crews are violent. They're involved not only in bank robberies, but they're part of the underworld and the crime culture in those neighborhoods. So it's not just impacting the banks out in the suburbs. They're bringing their violence and their actions into those neighborhoods as well. So he kind of brings that perspective. Shows a bank robbery is a subset of a broader criminal effort by these crews.
I know that in the actual investigation of the takeover bank robberies that we're reviewing today, Chris didn't play a part until one of the last robberies. So Chris is going to sit back and relax for a while, but we'll hear from him later. Vito, where do you want to start the case review?
We'll start with when I first started getting involved in this particular crew. I had a pretty strong informant base out in West Philadelphia, and that was stemming from the previous generation, as I mentioned, of bank robbers. West Philly, the 12th district, the Southwest Philly, the 18th and 19th districts are really where I was focusing my efforts. I was hearing rumors about the guys who used to steal the cars for the old bank robbers were now putting their own crew together. So I was looking around the region for any takeover robberies that kind of fit the MO, the modus operandi. So that's bad weather, a getaway car that was previously stolen, usually a couple of weeks beforehand and dropped. And then any witnesses that might see the switch location where you jump from the getaway car, the stolen getaway car, to switch cars. Those are usually good cars, and usually there's two of them. I started looking for robberies that fit that pattern, and I found one up in Montgomery County in Wynwood that occurred in June of 2003. That was a fleet bank. And I started looking at the particulars of it and thought, it could certainly match the MO I'm looking for and the street information that I'm getting. It was cemented for me when about 3 weeks later, another bank gets hit right outside the border up in Cheltenham, a Pan-Asian bank. Both banks were bad weather. The getaway car was a stolen minivan. They like the minivans because it's easy access in and out. The robber's driver can pull right up to the bank, and then the door slides open. Your bad guys jump out and head right into the bank. The Cheltenham bank was a Pan-Asian bank, and that was right at closing time. They missed the door. They locked up. So they actually shot through the door, shattered the glass, made their entry. MO is they round everybody up and they put them in the vault and shut the door. Now I start seeing a pattern. I believe these two banks are related. The real break came a week later when they hit a Citizens Bank way up in Northeast Philadelphia. Same MO, bad weather. Had a minivan. The switch site is normally in a public area like an apartment complex parking lot or a strip mall parking lot behind one of the back alleyways. And sure enough, that's what we saw in this bank. But this time they screwed up and they grabbed a die pack, jumped into the minivan and started escaping. The die pack activated. One of the robbers, later identified as a guy by the street name of Basile, Eric Humbert, he dropped the bag with a lot of the money, a couple of the guns, and his ski mask. That's really where the heart of the investigation started, was that July 18th date.
I'm assuming that the bad weather was to make sure there were fewer customers in the bank?
Yeah, they normally waited for bad weather, one, to cut down the foot traffic outside, and two, the foot traffic inside. Three, also to slow down the police response and then give them an opportunity to escape, be seen by less people. The other aspect of it is they do watch the banks and try and minimize the number of folks that are inside the banks, so timed entries. And then the use of the minivan, as I mentioned earlier, the sliding the door in and out, easy access to get out of the getaway car into the bank and then out. And then also a stolen minivan from a couple of weeks earlier isn't really going to raise too many concerns. That's the MO.
This dropped bag contains a lot of evidence. Is that how you started to identify the actual robbers that were responsible?
Yes. With that, there were a couple of guns, pistols. One was reported stolen. The other one was not. The one that was reported stolen was actually stolen off of a Philly cop a couple of years earlier. The other one was registered to a female from West Philadelphia. Typically, you look at something like that, you say, well, it's not stolen. Could be a boyfriend. Could be that she's involved. Or it could be what was pretty popular, and unfortunately still is popular, is it could have been a straw purchase where she was buying it for her boyfriend or somebody else. Following up on that pistol, it was bought out in Delaware County, identified the purchaser, went and hit her up. Kind of funny because I mentioned to my partner, said, we're going to go in and she's got to put on a show. Done this, unfortunately, too many times before. She'll put on a show, go upstairs, and then scream and say your gun is stolen. Sure enough, that's exactly how it happened. We go into the residence. She says, oh, let me go check my gun. It's right in my room. And I hear the scream. She comes down and says it's stolen. And she gave up her boyfriend, who was the ex-boyfriend by the time I got to her, an individual by the name of Maynard Patterson. With that, I started investigating Maynard Patterson. I had a couple of folks that knew him pretty well, so I put them on the trail to put him down. I saw that he had an outstanding warrant. That's where I started the investigation, and it took off from there. Okay, so an informant puts down Maynard hiding out at a house way up in Northeast Philly. Found the house, made entry. It was another girlfriend, another female acquaintance. She allowed me to look around. I found Mr. Patterson hiding under a bunch of boxes down in the basement, grabbed him, brought him back to the office. He proceeded to confess to his participation in the bank robbery. So not one of the ringleaders. He was brought in as a fill-in, but he had a lot of information to give me. So from there, I started putting together who the other subjects were. A couple of them I was familiar with, some of them I was not. And then also, at the time, these guys were extremely organized. And what they would do is they would case these banks out for a couple of weeks beforehand. They would come back at the same time of day, on the same day, to kind of measure the foot traffic, see who opens the bank up, see who closed the bank up. They communicate via cell phones. So unlike today, you got GPS and so forth. Back then, cell phones used cell towers. And as long as we got to the company within a few months, they would still have those cell tower records where basically a phone hits off the cell tower. Then you can get the quadrant. Cell towers are broken into 3 quadrants. You can get the quadrant of where that phone was located when it made a phone call. I started with Mr. Patterson's phone. Was able to identify the phones of the other subjects. I got the historical cell tower records and just started plotting them out. And that's where I had confirmed that the Fleet Bank was my crew and started seeing exactly who was involved in the different robberies. To back up a little bit, this crew was normally 12 to 15 folks. Each bank robbery would have personnel involved in each bank robbery. I had to identify which of the crew was good for the Fleet Bank in Wynwood, which of the crew was good for the Citizens Bank in Philly or the Pan Asian Bank. I did that, 1, through cooperation, but 2, through the cell phone records. I was able to show how they were casing the banks on these dates. They were calling each other. They were in the general area. One thing about the triangulation, the sector of a cell tower is it doesn't pinpoint the phone. It just gives you a triangle, maybe a mile to a mile and a half piece of the pie where that phone is in, but you can extrapolate and see that they're right next to each other. They're right next to this bank that gets robbed 2 weeks later. And then I could show that, hey, that's them casing the bank, and they did it in each 3 of these instances. I continued the investigation from there. Maynard Patterson provided me the details, and the case with many of these folks, even though they grow up next to each other, a lot of times they don't know their buddy's real name. They just know their street name. And that was the case with Eric Humbert. All Maynard Patterson knew was that his name was Basile. That's a fairly common name out in the West Philly area. So I'm trying to identify the Basiles I knew. I was trying to figure out which one it was and take the details that Maynard provided me and figure out who Basile was. Ultimately, Maynard Patterson brings up, almost as kind of an offhanded comment, that Basile had gotten locked up out in New Jersey. And he said they had done a home invasion to steal a minivan. They did a home invasion and they killed one of the occupants, an old man that lived in the house, and that he got locked up for that. The home invasion was to steal the minivan to use in a bank over in South Jersey. I took that information. I just started cold calling all the counties over in New Jersey. And I got lucky in Salem County where I talked to a lieutenant and he said, yeah, it sounds like we have a Basile we locked up. His true name is Eric Humbert. They are from Philadelphia. We locked them up for the home invasion and the sexual assault. The Robinsons lived in Carneys Point, New Jersey. On May 27th of 2003, 2 males entered the residence, proceeded to rob the residence. One of the males, later identified as Basile or Eric Humbert, took the 72-year-old's wife into the bedroom and proceeded to rape her, while the other subject, Rashawn Johnson, aka Kevin Johnson, had the husband, who was also in his 70s, and he was assaulting him, beating him up, sticking him in a bathtub in the bathroom that was just outside of the bedroom. So Mr. Robinson is hearing his wife getting raped while he's being assaulted and tied up in the bathtub. While this was going on, the lookout was parked in a parking lot of an adjacent business complex. There was a very alert security guard who saw this pickup truck sitting at the end of their business complex parking lot, adjacent to the cul-de-sac of where the Robinsons lived. She approached this individual. The individual took off. The individual later identified as Rasheem Jones takes off, and she gets a tag. She doesn't know that while she's confronting this lookout in a pickup truck, that there's a home invasion going on at the Robinsons' house. The Robinsons had been living on that cul-de-sac for generations. The street was actually named after the Robinson family. That's how long they had been living there. Mr. Robinson, after this event, suffered from full-blown dementia. And Mrs. Robinson, I'll go into how she plays into this investigation, was probably one of the bravest, strongest, smallest people that I had dealt with in my career.
I'm trying to understand this because when you said that they go out and steal a minivan a few weeks before the robbery, I'm thinking off the street. But this whole home invasion, my understanding, their whole purpose was to get the minivan. So why all of this assault and rape? I can't understand.
I mentioned a little earlier, these guys are violent individuals. Yes, usually they would steal a minivan off a street. They wouldn't want to raise concerns. They don't want any witnesses. In this particular instance, I would assume that they thought they were safe. They were not near Philadelphia, the city environment. They were over in New Jersey. Carney's Point it's farmland. It's open. They just made a mistake. They didn't adhere to their own rules. They saw a minivan and they saw what was an easy target and they thought they would take advantage. Let's go rob a house, see what we can get in there and grab the minivan. So that's what they did. Now, getting back to how the story was that Mr. Robinson had died during the assault, was that the investigators from Salem County Prosecutor's Office and Carney's Point, New Jersey, they did a fantastic job. They had no idea that this was the start of a bank robbery conspiracy. They just had a home invasion where the 72-year-old Mrs. Robinson was sexually assaulted. Both were assaulted and their minivan was stolen at gunpoint. They had their guns out. They did an excellent job in their canvas. They talked to this security guard. Her name was Sue Pedersen, who was very observant. And she said, yeah, when this was happening, I approached this pickup truck and here's the tag. And it was a rental car. So they followed up on the rental and they saw that he rented it in his real name and he left a cell phone number.
Wow.
Yep. So their investigation started again with that cell phone. They got the cell phone. They got historical records. They then got a local wiretap on that cell phone. And then they said, all right, let's go tickle the conversation. So they hit up Mr. Jones and they said, yeah, you were in this vicinity. At the time, there was a home invasion and the old man got killed. And they wanted to see how that would generate conversation. Sure enough, it did. He calls Jenkins and Humbert. That's how they get identified. Long story short, they arrest all three for the home invasion and the carjacking and the assaults. They lock them up. That's where I come in. I find out that, all right, they were there to rob a bank. I look back, and when I start getting to look at the cell tower information, I see the same pattern that Jenkins and Humbert's phones were in this Pensgrove area the previous couple of weeks. So I can say, okay, they're obviously together. They're calling each other. They're in the same sector that's bouncing off the same sector from the cell tower. What banks are there? I find a bank. I see that the bank was robbed way back in 1990 and they got close to $250,000 out of it. So a nice haul. And then saying, all right, I look at how that bank was done and it was the same exact way. I give these guys a lot of credit for being organized, but on the other hand, that organization kind of helped me identify the previous bank, also helped me to corroborate the fact that they were there for the bank robbery. That previous bank was a stolen minivan, was dropped in a nearby supermarket parking lot, was done on a day of bad weather. With that, I was able to approach the U.S. attorney here in the Eastern District of Pennsylvania. The attempted bank robbery, even though it happened in New Jersey, the conspiracy starts in the Eastern District of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. So I set up a meeting with the Salem County prosecutor and the investigators, and they were fantastic. What a great group of professionals. What I needed to make the broader case were the details of that incident. To bolster the investigation on the other 3 robberies in Pennsylvania, I needed to adopt the New Jersey case as an attempted bank robbery and a bank robbery conspiracy and the carjacking and so forth to strengthen the overall case. Same MO, talk about the cell phones.
And in incorporating their charges in New Jersey, does that include the assault and the sexual assault?
No. So the bank robbery, those would be enhancements, would not be a separate charge. So those are charged as enhancements. So basically it's the statutes, you have a point system where depending on violence, the number of victims, the number of loss, those points get added up and you come out with your sum total at the end, what the guidelines would be for that particular crime based on what happened during that crime. So that's how it was incorporated into the federal statute and ultimately our indictment.
But does Mr. and Mrs. Robinson get the justice that they're due?
Yep, absolutely. Like I said, Mrs. Robinson, she has since passed away, God bless her soul. She was 5'2", 100 pounds, soaking wet, but tough as nails to go through that in her twilight years. And then Mr. Robinson, we couldn't use him because he was full-blown dementia. He didn't know where he was. And then he just eventually, unfortunately, died. So Mrs. Robinson, one of our key witnesses. What happens is we work with the Salem County. They graciously agree to withdraw the guilty pleas from these individuals in order for us to adopt the case federally and charge it as a conspiracy to commit armed bank robbery. We also added the carjacking in, and then the enhancements for the home invasion and the assaults and so forth. Elements of those particular violent acts we can include in the elements of our case when we present it to the jury. As I mentioned, Mr. Robinson was full-blown dementia. Mrs. Robinson, we of course went to her because at this point they were pleading. She didn't have to testify in court. Now she would have to testify in court. She was more than willing to do that. One thing I'll mention also, this was big news in Salem County. That was a very quiet region of New Jersey, and this was big news for them. They got a lot of press when it happened, that such a violent act could happen. They got a lot of good coverage for the county prosecutor's office in Carney's Point. They were the heroes for solving this case in the way they did it. And to be willing to give that up was a good compliment to their character, desire to see the bigger picture. Ultimately, we charge them with that conspiracy. We present to the judge the previous robbery, how the MO is the same. We go to trial. The trial is separated, it's bifurcated. So Jones winds up pleading and cooperating federally. Jenkins and Humbert go to trial. They're separated, bifurcated. So there's one trial for Jenkins, one trial for Humbert. Jenkins, unfortunately, we had to do that 3 times. One time there was an issue with the jury instruction. He gets convicted. The issue with the jury instruction, we had to retry it. Mrs. Robinson had to testify in all 3. The second time there was a hung jury. Again, Mrs. Robinson had to testify about the home invasion and the assault. And then finally, he's convicted. She testifies again. Humbert goes to trial and he decides to go pro se and he represents himself. I've had a lot of trials. A lot of my cases went to trial. Some of them were more involved than others. Good memories on a whole bunch of them. But this trial, when Humbert was cross-examining Mrs. Robinson on the stand, he's talking to her. Keep in mind that during the home invasion, she never sees him because he has a mask and she's face down on the bed while he's raping her from behind. He then decides to take a hairspray bottle and insert it into her vagina, thinking that's going to kill his DNA. So he not only sexually assaults, he assaults her with that hairspray bottle. He's there cross-examining Mrs. Robinson, and we do have DNA. That's pretty strong evidence, but Nonetheless, he's cross-examining, saying that you can't identify me as that individual. And she stands up, all 5'2" of her, stands up and points the finger in a very dramatic voice, says, "It was you. You were taunting me the whole time." That was one of the moments I'll never forget.
Oh, she recognized his voice.
Yeah, recognized his voice because he's talking to her the whole time while he's raping her and talking to her while he's doing the cross-examination. And I just couldn't imagine in her 70s, 5'0", having the guy that raped her while her husband's getting beat and stuffed into a bathtub, having the courage to stand up and get her day of redemption and just point at him. It was like a Perry Mason moment. It was fantastic. So anyway, he gets convicted. I'll go back to the other robberies over in Pennsylvania. Because Jenkins and Jones are not part of these other robberies as different members of the crew, and for other legal reasons, those trials are put together. So the New Jersey incident was handled by itself in the Eastern District, and then we charged the other 3 bank robberies in the Eastern District. And that's the Pan Asian Bank in Cheltenham, Fleetwood Bank up in Wynwood, and the Citizens Bank in Philadelphia. Those all happened over the summer of '03. While we're investigating the Carney's Point incident, which was actually happened first. I'm not sure if I mentioned it happens on May 27, 2003. The other 3 banks over in Southeast Pennsylvania, they started in July, pretty much June to July. From continued discussions with our cooperator, Mr. Patterson, I identify and am able to charge a couple of the other individuals involved in the different banks, and they cooperate. I start putting together a picture of the breadth of this enterprise, of this crew, that there's a whole nother group that a guy by the name of Ms. or Marcel Harper, who was good buddies with Mr. Humbert, was training and sending out to do other banks. So now, with this information, I start targeting this other crew. We go to trial on the 3 banks in Southeast Pennsylvania. And then one thing I'll mention was actually from pretty reliable source information. I hear that Mr. Harper and Mr. Humbert were the ones that did that bank in Penns Grove, New Jersey, way back in 1990. Now I start focusing on Harper, who had just finished a 10-year stint in the state. That's why those bank robberies didn't continue through the mid-90s, because he was locked up, as was Mr. Humbert, for unrelated crimes. I think Harper was in on other robberies. Humbert, I think, same thing, on other robberies and possibly assaults. They're in state custody. They get out. They go right back into business, put their crews back together, and start their bank robbery enterprise. We go to trial on Humbert on the banks that summer of '03, and then I start looking for similar banks after the summer of '03. And that's where I identify a bank down in Delaware, another bank out in Brookhaven, the Citizens Bank in Brookhaven, and Artisans Bank down in Delaware. And the reason I identified the one in Delaware is because a couple of my cooperators start talking about how Humbert and Harper have this other crew that they've recruited. They're music promoters, and they call themselves spoiled spenders. Well, in the Artisan Bank, there's a witness in a nearby apartment complex in Wilmington, Delaware, that saw a bunch of individuals jump from one car, and a couple of those individuals get into a custom van, a wrapped van. And they remember that there were a bunch of music notes on it and something to the effect of, wasn't spoiled spenders, but it was close enough where I said, okay, bingo, that's it. Start looking at that, start identifying the individuals responsible for those robberies. And there were a couple of robberies, but the ones where I had good evidence, where the MO was the same, was the Citizens in Brookhaven and the Artisans in Delaware. And that's where Mr. Booker kind of comes into play. So Chris gets recruited for the robbery in Brookhaven in the Citizens Bank.
This would be a good point to bring Chris in. So, Chris, you're joining the bank robbery investigation at this point. Had you ever done a bank robbery before? And what made you say yes when they asked you to take part?
I'd never done a bank robbery before. It's like I said, I used to rob local people, drug dealers, no stores or nothing like that. So when it came to me, it was more like a challenge, I guess. Is you scared? Is you built for this? All right, yeah, I'm built for it. Let's get to it. But as the process was going on, I thought they was going to change their mind or they was faking. Oh, they was for real. Went through the whole rehearsals. We had rehearsed at this location where it was, a little open, and they had set up some things to make it seem like the inside of the bank did the little rehearsals and all that. And I'm just like, oh, this for real. So waited. Then I got the phone call. It's go time. I'm like, you sure? I was kind of hoping they was getting ready back out. So I'm like, all right, let's go then. Everything was broken down. Like, this is what it is. Took precautions, masked up, gloved up. Don't touch nothing. Don't cough on anything. Don't scratch your hair, things of that nature. So this was the day of it. Remember vividly. Got out the car. We all went to the bank. 3 of us. Get into the bank. Everybody do their job. One was to hit the counter. The other was to clear the patrons from the lobby and get them all together. My job was to cover the door and make sure nobody comes in or goes out. Nervous, I went clean off of my job. I didn't even do my job fully because once we got to the bank, I went straight and helped out with getting the people in the lobby together. It was a rush, one that I never felt dealing drugs or robbing people. This was a different kind of rush.
Was it a rush that you enjoyed?
No, it was a scared rush. Afterwards, it was like oh snap, I really did that. I really just robbed the bank. They got away with it. And it was like, I don't know if I could do it again. Maybe if I had to. It was like something different than everything that I've done before.
All right, let's get back to the story. Tell us more. What happened at that point?
Again, we're finalizing the investigation of the other 3 banks that Humbert was involved in. That's the Wynwood Bank, the Citizens Bank, and the Pan Asian Bank at Cheltenham. Digging through junkyards, finding ski masks that Humbert was wearing, and he dropped in this junkyard. I'm able to go back and get DNA from Humbert, all for that trial. Meanwhile, I'm starting to build the case on and identify who's involved in these other banks. I know who Marcel Harper is at this point. I don't know who the other folks are because my cooperators, they were like a separate sub-crew of the Humbert Harper enterprise. They didn't know those guys other than their music promoters. Ultimately, we convict Humbert for the 3 banks. Humbert was also convicted over for Jersey conspiracy, attempted robbery that we discussed earlier. And then I'm trying to identify who these individuals are. Ultimately, I find the van, start building a case, identifying who's associated with this music producing label. But then I get a break. I didn't know it at the time. I get a call from one of my informants and they said, hey, this guy by the name of Chris Booker just killed a dude out in Derby. It was a drug robbery and he shot over and he's hiding out over in Atlantic City. So I reach out to a couple of the detectives that I knew pretty well, reach out to them, said, hey, did you have a murder? And sure enough, they had one in broad daylight where the guy was just slumped and left right on the sidewalk. And I said, well, I think your guy's this guy, Chris Booker, and he's hiding out in Atlantic City. Now, this is all around October of 2004 when that murder happens. We're just finishing up on the trial of Humbert for the banks, Pennsylvania. And I'm still building my case against the spoiled spenders. And I don't know Chris Booker. His name has not come up. But it did come up because of the drug-related murder and the fact he was hiding in Atlantic City. They then find out that he gets arrested in Atlantic City with some drugs, crack cocaine, which was what was taken, and a couple of guns.
Chris, why don't you tell us about that arrest? Tell us more about what happened in Atlantic City.
It's unfortunate. I got to meet Vito under the circumstances that I had to meet him under. At this time, I was involved in a homicide. My apologies as always to the family for the actions that I did. My heart is always sincerely in debt to them. And at this time, I had committed this crime, went on a run. Me going on a run, I found myself in New Jersey and I decided to set up shop there. During the course of that, the universe, God, what I would say, said that I had enough. And I was incarcerated for having 2 firearms in my room. A maid came by, cleaned my room out one day and found 2 firearms. She told the manager called his friend who was a police officer. They came to the room and waited for me to come back and lock me up with 2 guns and for what I had on my possession, which was a nice amount of crack cocaine at the time. During that time, I was thinking about the person who I was with. I was with a young lady at the time who was my girlfriend at the time. When I did get incarcerated for it, I was going to just take my case just as long as they would let her go. And this is something that I explained when he came to see me. And when the homicide detectives came to see me, I just told them, look, I'm just taking my case that's here with the drugs, and y'all just have to let her go. In doing so, Philadelphia adopted the case, the drugs and the guns. The federal system adopted the case. My drug case was now federal. I explained the same thing to Vito during the interview, that I'm gonna take my case and just make sure that she get let go. And it happened. I took my case. She got out. At that point, I decided to change my mind. I said, the hell with it. Take my chances and try. And while I was incarcerated and I was down the federal building, ran into a couple of guys who was good with legal work and things of that nature. One in particular, the one I shouldn't have trusted, but did. He helped me out with some legal issues. He had some good points with illegal search and seizures and things of that nature. And it made me confident that you can beat this. You can beat this in a suppression hearing. They shouldn't have never went into your hotel room. They ain't have no exigent circumstances going into your hotel room. So I'm like, okay, I get the guns thrown out. I'm scot free. And that's me thinking about not just the hotel case, but also my homicide case, because one of the weapons was the murder weapon. So I'm like, man, if I can get these suppressed federally, then there's no case on me at all. There's nothing anybody can stand on, because this is the real evidence right here.
I really appreciate you acknowledging the victim, but we probably need to say something about the murder. Can you tell us a little bit, or whatever you're able to tell us at this time, about this murder that you were involved in?
This murder that I was involved in at the time, I was going through some financial hardships. One of the things I used to do, I used to I used to rob drug dealers. They were an easier target. And this is something that I had did this particular day. This time I was, just like I said, I was going through some financial hardships and picked so to say, the easiest drug dealer that I could in order to get what I wanted at the time. It's unfortunate, he was close, something that was unexpected from me, to him. And that's pretty much what it was.
So you were trying to rob him of his drugs and money, and during that, you ended up shooting and killing him.
Right. Still, today it's hard to talk about, just thinking of my actions. It's him as well, but it's more so like the actions that, I took to get money. I'm sweating now just thinking about the foolishness that I was on around that time.
And would you say that was one of the things that helped you walk away and step away from that life?
Definitely. It was the biggest mistake in my life, and the most thing that I would regret for the remainder of my life. It's not something that goes away. It's not something to live with on a day-to-day basis, because I think about it every day. I think about my actions every day. And I think about the life that was lost every day for nothing. That's something that I live with every day, and it motivates me to stay away from that lifestyle.
I'm going to let Vito talk about what happened after he learned that you had been arrested in Atlantic City. And then we'll come back to you to talk about what you're doing now. Vito, let's get back to the case review and tell us how the rest of the investigation proceeds.
All right, so I get this information. I relay it to Darby. Darby goes out. They go hit up Mr. Booker in Atlantic County Correctional Facility. And he doesn't talk to them, but he does say, hey, I've got bank robbery information. I'm only going to talk to the FBI. So they give me a call and they say, hey, this guy wants to talk about bank robbery information. I'll say, all right, whatever.
When you first sit down with him, what's your impression of this first time that you've met? Could you talk about that?
Sure. So the first time I meet Chris, again, my Darby detective buddies reach out to me. So I go out and talk to him. And I have no idea what bank robbery he's going to talk about. But I do know that they got two guns there, and one of those guns is the murder weapon. And I learned a lot about Mr. Booker, and he's got a well-known, tough reputation on the street. So I wasn't quite sure what to expect. I go over to Atlantic City Correctional Facility. They set me up. We sit down. He's a big dude, Chris, you got some size to him. So he's an opposing dude. I could see, all right, this guy's definitely going to have some rep, and he's got the actions to back it up. I was very impressed. He was respectful, well-spoken, clearly intelligent, and had a little charisma to him. You got to understand, he ran a block out in West Philly, meaning he ran the drugs. He had people working for him, people putting themselves out there. You have to have some charisma, some leadership skills to be able to organize and run a block and earn the respect of people to do so they do what you tell them. He had that. So I was impressed with Mr. Booker. So, yeah, I sit down with Chris. Again, it was a good conversation. Not an issue. He was very forthcoming with his involvement in the bank robbery and also admitting to the guns and drugs. In the back of my head, I'm knowing he doesn't know that I know what happened with the murder and that gun is the murder gun. Even if we adopt it, the locals are still going to run the ballistics and match it to the murder. But adopt the case. He starts talking about the bank. I'm trying to hide my excitement and I start going through my book with the details of the bank. That actually helps me further the investigation and identify the other individuals through then to phone records and just saying, okay, who does this guy, Chris Booker, who is he associating with? And that's how I identify this guy, Big Nasty, was his street name, goes by the name of Bernie Tyndale, big football-sized dude, Manny, G. I started identifying them. They were associated with the same general neighborhood in Westville. Mr. Booker starts talking to jailhouse lawyers. There's another inmate who knows the law or tells other people they know the law, and they make money off it. They'll charge people and say, hey, I'll look at your case, see what you can do. Either they don't trust their attorneys or they want to double check their attorneys or see what other options there are. And they talk to these jailhouse attorneys, and Booker, one of these jailhouse attorneys, got in his ear and starts convincing Chris that he could beat the case in Jersey, talking about how it was a bad search and to get the guns tossed. And he's thinking he could beat the murder rap now. And he decides to go to trial on the guns and drugs. The best part, Jerry, is the guy he was talking about, the jailhouse attorney, and what happened when they put him in a cell together.
Yeah, I was on my way to trial. No, I was on my way to a hearing. My lawyer kept telling me that they got a new witness. They got a new witness. I'm like, who could this possibly be? He was like, do you know a guy named David? As soon as he said his first name, I just was like, oh my goodness. Yeah, that's the person who's been helping with my legal work. My lawyer said, I told you not to talk to these guys. He's now a star witness on your case. You just made my job even harder. So I'm going to a hearing, trying to get some evidence suppressed. And I was trying to get David Blickley's statement suppressed as well. I'm on my way to the holding cell. They open up the holding cell door. I go in. Guess who's sitting there? David Blickley. Just sitting there. He looked up at me and his jaws just dropped. And he immediately started trying to explain, I didn't say anything. I'm like, what are you talking about? I'm trying to keep him cool. So this guard closed the door. So once the door was closed, I commenced to putting the beating on him. I was trying my best to do as much damage to him as I possibly could in the short period of time that I had. I broke his nose or something like that, beat him up pretty bad. I made him clean up his own blood. When the guard came by, the guard looking at him on the ground, wiping up his own blood, they call the rest of the staff, take me out the cell, and I'm not sure. I think he went to the hospital after that. And he continued to be a star witness on the case.
And it was just a coincidence that you were put in the same cell?
It was a mistake on the guard's behalf. He's supposed to have a separation on me. Once he turned as a witness, he's supposed to be separated from. And I'm quite sure that the prosecutor put a separation on us once he had the information he had from David Blickley. They're supposed to put a separation on us immediately. So we can't be in contact with each other at all. Can't be on the same floor. We can't be in the same holding cell, none of that. So quite sure he had a separation put on us, but the guards must not have been aware of it. And they just so happened to just put me in that cell.
Wow. Did you get any additional charges or any issues?
I had got 6 months in a hole, which actually turned into, I was in a hole for almost 2 years behind that. They gave me the assault on a federal witness, gave me 6 months in a hole. I wasn't charged additionally in federal court for it, but jail charged me and took a lot of my good time. which I didn't even have none at the time, but they took my phones and my visits from me for a year, and I ended up staying nearly my whole time, going back and forth to trial.
This is the hole in the detention center. And what does that mean?
It's funny because we call a hole as segregated, you separate from everyone else. It's 23 and 1. You and yourself, 23 hours, out for an hour. It's where people who cause trouble go to. Can't be around nobody.
Any regrets?
For David Blickley?
Mm-hmm.
No. Sorry to say. I got to put my regrets where they need to be. For him, I can't put no regret. I only regret me relying on him to help me out, because that was the whole thing that I was looking for, was help. He disguised himself as somebody who wanted to help me and somebody who cared about my situation and wanted to help get me out or help get me the best result that I can get. And I trusted him with that. I explained to him things about my case that I wouldn't explain to nobody else. I entrusted him with that information, and he betrayed me. That was a hurtful feeling, to be betrayed that way, in that manner. Paid him my money to help me with this issue, just turned around and hit me on the butt.
Yeah, so basically what happens is David Blickley, he reaches out through the prison intel unit. And I had a good relationship with them. And they had this guy talking about a guy giving up his bank robbery details. So they reached out to me, and it happened to be my case. So I went and talked to him, and sure enough, everything Chris would feed him, he was feeding me. Typically, the deal is you don't put a separation order in until you have to, because once a separation order is put in, then the defendant, the subject, knows, damn, this guy's cooperating on me because they put a separation order. So that's probably what happened. We put the separation order in, they didn't get it into the system, and they didn't know we were supposed to be separated. I remember it was a hearing, I'm sitting there, we hear a bunch of, hustling around in the courtroom. I knew something was up, and sure enough, they said, yeah, your star witness just got his ass beat. And Blickley is the one that convinced him to go to trial.
Yeah, I forgot about that.
Yeah. I continue the investigation, and I start looking at the spoil spenders and identifying who they are. There, I start getting informants, getting as much details, surveillances, all the typical investigative stuff to try and build that case against the other individuals. Keep in mind, I don't really have a cooperator that's fingering them. Okay, Chris gave himself up, and then he decided to go to trial anyway, so couldn't use that. But I build the case. If I remember right, I think we arrest Big Nasty first, way up in North Philly near the Montgomery border. Grab Mr. Tyndale. After a little bit, he didn't want to go quietly initially, but finally we get him, comes in, then he confesses, starts laying everything out. That helps me build a case against the others. And then I arrest the others, but I'm still trying to build a case on the ringleader, which is this guy, Miz, or Marcel Harper. I arrest the others, Gerald Soule, Ronnie Muir. Ronnie Muir's family, they owned a daycare center out in West Philly. I arrest all these individuals. I don't have enough to charge Harper yet, but I get cooperation, and now I have enough to get Harper. And what Harper was doing was he had gotten a little smarter in his old age, and he was using these guys, training them. They would set up the basement. They would set up the second floor of the daycare center. They would set it up like the inside of the bank that they were targets. They would send either a female or girlfriend in to case the bank out well in advance. They would set the basement or the room up like the bank and then rehearse and practice. And they would time each other and lay out the specific roles. They would go out and case the banks. Very efficient. And Harper, for years of experience, was imparting that experience to other crew. Finally, I'm able to charge Harper. I arrest him. He's on parole, and he was actually at the time living with a female police officer, never able to prove that he used her gun in any of these bank robberies. That was a whole separate issue. Anyway, arrest Harper. Initially, I get a confession from him, but then he goes south also and decides to go to trial. And we convict him at trial of the planning, participation, and the conspiracy of both the Artisan and the Citizens Bank robbery.
Chris, these other guys are getting some bad advice whether to plea or go to trial.
Right. Yeah, well, exactly. With Harper, and Harper's a smart, I'll give him credit. Not an unlikable guy, violent, getting other people to do their stuff. So obviously, same thing with Chris. He's got some charisma to him, some leadership ability. If he had put it to the right use, maybe he would have done something different. But articulate and got kids, weren't kids. I mean, they were adults, pretty big-sized adults, to go rob these banks. and he's teaching them to be as violent as possible. The action of violence controls the banks, and that's what he's preaching to these folks. And sure enough, like the Citizens Bank robbery, Chris told you, it's pretty bad. They got ski masks on, they got guns out, they're parading these folks into the vault at gunpoint, screaming and hollering. They're in and out. I mean, it's pretty traumatizing events for the poor folks that are in the banks at these times. And it came from Harper. Charismatic dude, was very respectful, gave me a confession, wrote it all down on paper, and then got some bad advice, and he decides to go to trial too. Tries to get the confession thrown out, label me as I made it all up and liar and all that stuff, but he was convicted at trial.
What happened to Maynard Patterson, who cooperated at the beginning? And of course, I would like to hear more about what happened with Chris, especially when it came to the murder conviction.
The whole case broke with Mr. Patterson. He also identified a whole separate crew that he was part of, and Shannon Johnson, who was another one of the individuals part of the bank robbery conspiracy that wound up cooperating for me. They wound up doing a $900,000 armored truck up in Abington in the midst of all this, but with a whole separate crew from up north part of Philadelphia. So these guys were not just part of this enterprise in Maynard, but they had a whole bunch of stuff going. As a result of Maynard and his cooperation, and obviously he got some significant consideration on his sentencing for all the help he did. It wasn't only the banks he was talking about. And remember, he's the one that directed me over to New Jersey, where I was able to identify the Carney's Point incident with the Robinsons. Ultimately, there were a bunch of murders that we solved off of this case, a bunch of other robberies. They were doing home invasion robberies, different members of this crew, drug dealing. It wasn't just the bank robberies and this crew that we were able to lock up. They had a bunch of follow-on investigations that had some good results. Patterson, I'll give him credit. He started me on that journey, even though he went to trial twice.
And what did he get?
For Patterson, I want to say 84 months, but I'm not sure what Patterson was sentenced to. The guys that went to trial, including Chris, he mentioned that there are some laws that changed and then retroactively reduced some of his sentence. He also, not to bore with the technical aspects of it, but in the bank robbery trial where he represented himself, there was an incorrect instruction where he was improperly advised of what sentence he would be looking at if convicted because of the use of a gun. So he was told it was 5 years if he gets convicted on the gun charge, where in fact it was 25 years. So that conviction actually got tossed and we had to retry it, but Mr. Booker decided to plea, throw his mercy on the court and on us, U.S. Attorney's Office. Maynard got his time. I'm sure he's out and hopefully doing well. Chris got something in the range of close to 70 years, all total, between the Jersey guns and drugs conviction and the bank robbery conviction. He got close to 70 years, whatever that comes out in months.
Chris, your redemption, your stepping away from that life, did that start while you were incarcerated, or did that start once you came out in 2021?
That started while I was incarcerated. I was facing a lot of time. I had a lot of time under my jacket, where my release date was 2067. Due to, vigorous appeals and, steadfast prayer and, things of that nature, begging God for another opportunity and, disavowing all the things that I used to be into. My prayers was answered. I did win my appeal, came back. I had a way to reach out to Vito. It's funny. The story about that is funny. And, I just reached out just to let him know, man, look, I changed, man. I'm not into the streets no more. I really just need another chance. And this is something that's rare. And he believed me. After all we went through, he believed me. It was more of a process. I was still in court. Just like I said, I had won my appeal and, I'm back in the federal detention center, awaiting a new trial. So, of course, my lawyers had to reach out to the prosecutor at the time and Vito at the time to, see if we can come up with some kind of deal to avoid having to go to trial again, bringing witnesses back and, going over this whole trial again, because that's what I was granted, a whole new trial. So during the course of me being down there, I just was pleading for a good deal that I can take and come home one day, opposed to maybe never coming home. So, I reached out. I had got Vito's phone number off of my 302s. And I just so happened to call. And when I called, I just, was apologetic, let him know, look, I'm getting ready to go back to trial, man. I'm trying to get a deal, man. Like, I don't know what it is, what it's going to be, but, just know that I changed. I'm not the same person. That's what made me reach out to him. And it wasn't, no sidewinding stuff or not like that, trying to be slick or not like that. It was really just like letting the people know that I really did change. I really did make some changes in my life, and it's not the life I want to live. It's a blessing that he heard me, and he heard that I was writing books. I told him that I was writing books and, staying out of trouble and following the programs within the prison system. And, I let him know all the things that I was doing and all that and all the changes that I made. And shocked me, surprised me that when I took a deal and when I went to go get resentenced, all these things came up. And, ultimately, it wasn't too much of a fight from the other side, and I appreciate that. I will always be indebted. He's a good guy. Some people, in the criminal world, what, a federal agent, good guy? No, it can't be. He's a good guy. He, when everybody else, all my friends and all that stuff left me behind, left me with 106 years, including my state time. When everybody turned their back on me and thought that I was just the worst of the worst, and I made the changes in my life. It took a FBI agent to see the changes in my life, to see the sincerity, to help and give me another chance. I do appreciate that, because without that, I'd be still sitting in prison, probably with a lengthy sentence. Even coming back on an appeal and getting a new trial, they could have easily just took me back to trial and brought all the witnesses back again, and it would have been the same results.
We got to give Vito a chance to talk about that very first phone call that you got when you learned that he won his appeal and that there was either going to be a new trial or a new sentencing. What was your thought when you got that call and you heard who was on the other end of the phone? What was that like?
Well, when I received the call, it was out of nowhere. I mean, I was getting a lot of calls from different cases from the prison. So it was the same number that shows up. I'm thinking it's somebody else. And it says you got a call from Chris Booker. I said, whoa. Chris was, like he says, he was one of the more violent dudes I dealt with. Just a history. He had a reputation on the street. But, I arrested him, went talked to him the first time. He was always a gentleman. I always respected that. He was highly intelligent. I was always impressed with that. And, even though we're on the other sides of the fence, he wasn't somebody that you would just dislike. He had had some charisma to him. So took the call. They told me what the situation was. I had just been told that, hey, Chris, who had represented himself at trial. Now, this is the bank robbery trial. This is not the drug trial. So the drug trial's in Jersey. The bank robbery trial for the bank in Brookhaven, Pennsylvania, was done over in Philadelphia. So he represented himself in that trial in Philadelphia. He even cross-examined me on the stand. But even so, didn't try and embarrass me, in front of the jury or anything like that. He was respectful the whole time. I remember having a conversation with him and telling him that, man, make something out of your life in prison. There's a lot of opportunity there. Write a book. Got some experiences. And he did. So I was curious to hear what he had to say. And I actually did a little checking. I mean, he was very sincere. And I'm no soft. You do your crime, you do your time. But something about him, what I remember about him, just being a real smart guy who just took the wrong path. I checked him out, called counselors, and sure enough, they all spoke highly of the guy and said he did turn his life around. So that impressed me. But what happens was the government had to make a decision whether to take him back to trial. At this point, he's locked up since 2004. And at this point, it's a number of years later. He's done quite a bit of time, in prison already. And is it really worth taking him to trial again? The expense and the effort. Now, if I had said, yeah, no, this guy's, bad news and he's still bad news. He gets out. Watch out. Public's going to be in danger. I did not think that. And I let my opinion be known. And long story short is the government did not contest his resentencing. And then in 2021, he gets released. And then Chris and I would just kind of stayed in contact. I was curious to see how he would do. I'll let him tell you, but the guy's got his CDL. He's got his life together. And, I knew he would because he's got something he can give back. So that was how the relationship grew.
All right, Chris, this is your opportunity to tell us your redemption story, how things have worked out. What have you been doing since your release in 2021? And how many years total was that you were incarcerated?
17 and a half years.
Since you've been released, tell us all the great things that Vito was mentioning or teasing us about as far as what you're doing now. Tell us about the books.
Yeah, still writing. I'm trying to collab with Blank Carrington right now to do a TV series on single ladies. We changed the name from single ladies to the acronym GRITS, Girls Raised in the South. And right now, trying to get actors and some financing behind it. Just working. The best thing that I've done so far is reconnect with my family. That was a process, man. Me being away for 17 and a half years, it's a very long time. So, reconnecting with my family, man, just been beautiful. Working, had several jobs, worked in a factory. I was a forklift operator for quite some time. I used to load trucks, 18 wheelers with cement. And I figured, why not be the driver? So went and got my CDL, decided to drive trucks. Been doing that for the past year and a half. Been driving 18 wheelers, just traveling the country, all over the country, enjoying my time out. Been all over the country, nearly every state so far. So it's just been beautiful. Vacation spots, just just enjoying life at this time.
Well, I see here that your book, under the name of Single Ladies, is on Amazon, both as an audiobook and an ebook and a paper book. So I do want to let you know that I'm going to put a link to it in the show notes for this episode. You were explaining to me why it is under the author name of Blake Carrington instead of Chris Booker. So why don't you explain that to everyone listening?
If you look a little deeper, some of the covers do got Blake Carrington and Chris Booker, but the main one is under Blake Carrington. And that's because I was incarcerated. During the time I wrote these books while I was incarcerated, I wrote probably around 40 books for different authors. I was selling them straight up or, just selling the rights to some, keeping the rights to others. A lot of my books I did with Blake Carrington, and we had a partnership. I write the books, he put them out there. Being a prisoner, I'm not going to get that much traction out there with my name on the book. So he's out there. He can promote the books better and, make more money for the both of us, at the time. So, that's why his name is on the book. He's a good guy. That's my guy. He's been a real gem for me while I was in prison.
And most of these books, for those who might be interested, is there a general theme or premise for the books?
These are urban novels. If you read any book that came from me that I've written, it's going to have a portion of my life in it somewhere, in some way, shape, or form. Something that happened or transpired in my life is actually in the books. I had to change the characters or the names of some of the people, just like Vito there, turned him into a female federal agent.
Say that again. You wrote a book.
I wrote a book called Diamond Rush. It's about three guys who robbed the bank. These three guys that robbed the bank. A lot of the details of the book of them robbing the bank, it actually came from my life. Came from when I was involved in a bank robbery. But you had an FBI agent that was on those three bank robbers, and she was a female agent, but that was really Vito.
Come on. What a payback.
Yeah, that's a payback. And after all you've done for him, and he does that.
No kidding, man. Way to do me.
Well, Chris, it's been wonderful talking with you and being able to share a little bit of your life story with the listeners. At the end of my conversations with my guests, I like to ask them for any words of wisdom that they would like to share. What would you like to say?
I would like to say if you don't have God in your life, you have to search for him because he's an intricate part of all of our lives. Another thing is to the younger youth that's out there right now, get off the streets. There's plenty of jobs out here we can't complain about. There's no jobs and there's no this and there's no that. Plenty of jobs out here, plenty of opportunities, plenty of ways to make legal money. Get off the streets. running around with guns and shooting people for no good reason and shooting at people and just committing all the heinous crimes that's being committed, especially in Philadelphia. Get off the streets. It's not worth it.
I was supposed to be giving you your opportunity, but I had to ask you, if somebody had said that to you back in the day, would you have been able to just say, "Oh, you're right," and walk away?
And that's the thing. While I was in the streets, I didn't have that. Well, I'm lying. My father, awesome guy. He passed. Funeral is tomorrow, actually.
Oh, I am so sorry to hear that. My condolences to you.
Thank you. He did an amazing job. He did the best he could raising these three knucklehead boys that he had that was just so defiant. But he always wanted good for us. He always tried to deter us from the streets, and especially me. And that was the only person who really was in my life trying to get me from out the streets. But when the streets, you tend to not look toward somebody that's not in the streets. I had somebody out there that really was like, leave these streets alone. Somebody would have gave me the advice that I just tried to give the youth, I probably would have went into the military, like my dad told me to.
What a gift for you and for him that he was able to see you step back from the life and to see that after all those years of him telling you that there was a better way, that you found that way.
That's a highlight. Before he had passed away, we used to talk about that, man. He used to let me know how proud he is of me. Got my own house, got my own car, married, doing everything right, staying off the streets, just working and providing, doing everything that he used to do for our family. Now, growing up, being older, I took after that. And he always tell me how proud he is of me. That's always going to be in my heart because something that I always wanted to do was make my dad proud.
Thanks, Chris. I really appreciate you accepting my invitation to come on the show today. I really want to thank you for sharing your story with us today. Vito, we're at the point of the interview where I need to ask you my standard question, which is when and why did you join the FBI?
I joined February of 97 when I went to Quantico, but that was my lifelong goal from as long as I can remember. My dad was a Hoover agent. He came in under Hoover, was an FBI agent, was a door kicker his entire career, one of the baddest, toughest men I've ever known. I looked up to him and that FBI family. So I grew up in the FBI family. So my dad and all his partners, we all lived in the same neighborhood. A lot of them were New Yorkers. My dad was from Brooklyn. And I grew up in North Jersey around these people and in the gatherings. And I just absolutely loved. They were great storytellers. Absolutely loved the stories. That's what I wanted to do. I wanted to be an FBI agent from as long as I can remember. Finally, they made the mistake and I got in. I was in the Coast Guard previously. Great job. Absolutely loved it. Got seasick all the time, but absolutely wasn't a question. When the offer came, I jumped at it, started Quantico, got out. Got lucky, got my first choice, Philadelphia. My dad knew the SAC, so the SAC took care of me and put me on the best squad in the division, which was the bank robbery squad. Like I said earlier, that's where it was happening. It was the bank robbery squad in Philadelphia was known throughout the Bureau because we were active and had some really good, top-notch, legendary investigators on the squad. And he put me there as a green agent. Never looked back since. Absolutely loved it.
When I came into the Philadelphia division, they would go to this club in New Jersey. I would go to hang out, and that's where I met my husband. So I owe my marriage and my children to the bank robbery squad in Philadelphia, old squad 10.
There you go. I mean, a lot of things happened on that squad. And to this day, that squad is still the premier squad. And there were some characters. I mean, you remember some of the folks. There were definitely some colorful people on that squad. Themselves had great investigations, great cases. I was very lucky. And I never looked at the clock, never looked back. I absolutely loved every day going to work.
We have to acknowledge your supervisor when you first got on that squad, which of course is Mike Carbonell. And I have interviewed him on this podcast. One of the earlier episodes, I'll have to look it up. He was definitely a character.
Oh my God, yeah. Talk about characters. Absolutely love the guy. My first supervisor was Warren Griggs. So when I first got there, Warren was the supervisor. Carbo was the supervisor of the Fugitive Squad 12. They had their own reputation with some top-notch door kickers on that squad, and then we merged. I think that was before 9/11, where they merged squads, and Warren retired and Carbo became the supervisor of the joint fugitive bank robbery squad. Then I had a number of good years, which was, again, that just added to the fun I had on that squad with that knucklehead as my boss. He was the best.
He was on episode 15, where he talked about a kidnapping case for ransom of a toddler. And of course, his most famous case, which was the Ira Einhorn fugitive investigation.
Yeah, Mike, a legendary agent. While he was on the street, he put together some of the best Philadelphia bureau-wide fugitive cases, including that one. He was going over to Europe, put a lot of time, effort, and brought that guy to justice finally. He did that in a number of high-profile cases. He was a great agent, great boss.
Talking about high-profile cases, now we chose this particular takeover bank robbery case to review today, and it's a great case, but your biggest case during your career is still unsolved. Can we take a moment to talk about that case?
Sure. That's one, obviously, that stays with you. It was a couple, Danielle Otterbray. She was married, Danielle Imbo, married name, and Richard Patron Jr. They disappeared after leaving a South Philly bar called Abilene's on South Street. February 19th, 2005. They were last seen leaving that bar. They disappeared along with Patron's black Dodge Dakota pickup truck. Normally, disappearance is not a federal investigation. There's no federal jurisdiction just simply for a disappearance. We weren't involved initially in the investigation. There was no extortionate demands, so it wasn't a kidnapping, which would be federal. No federal nexus at the time, but we had a very good relationship and still do to this day with the Philadelphia Police Department. Give them a plug. One of the most outstanding police departments in the country, good people. We had a great relationship with them. In fact, our squad at the time was about half Philly detectives and half agents. So my partners were some of the best investigators I ever worked with, Philly PD detectives. So we helped out when they needed help with either surveillance or doing some background checks or checking the bank records for activity on credit cards. They came to us and asked for help. I remember Mike Carbonell. I remember him walking over, and this was probably a couple of weeks after the couple actually disappeared. And it was starting to get a lot of press. It was a human interest story for sure, because these two good people with good families just disappeared. There was a lot of publicity surrounding it. And then I remember Carbo walking over. I'm sitting on my desk, and he drops phone records on my desk and asked me to help out South detectives going through and working the phone records and cell towers and all of that stuff. I'd used it to some good effect on my bank robbery cases, and that's where I started getting involved. So that case had a lot of ups and downs. I retired last year in 2023, leaving this case unsolved.
Is that something that kind of gets to you?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. February 2005, I don't think since then there wasn't a day I obsessed on the case. I mean, we're all fathers, brothers, sons, have kids. It's hard not to get personally involved. Of course, it's my job, it's an investigator's job to stay professional and do the case, but hard not to get involved when you had two great families, the Patrons and the Otterbrays. These two people, everything I found out about them, good people, nobody deserves it. Certainly why these two got my pretty strong suspicions, but I couldn't solve it. I obsessed on it every day, long nights, long mornings, long weekends, trying to put the case together and make headway, and then find out that it's not what happened and start another trail. And then I retired, telling the families that, hey, I'm calling it quits, was probably one of the tougher days of my bureau career. I still stay engaged with the families, and it's still, just like every homicide detective has that one or two cases that sticks in their craw. This was the one for me. I investigated a lot of pretty violent, nasty folks, nasty crimes, but this is the one that will stick with me. Maybe one day it gets solved, maybe.
That would be great. I will also include a link in the show notes for this episode to one of the articles about that case. Of course, I remember it well because it was during the time I moved from investigating fraud, and became the spokesperson and the media rep. So I worked very closely with you in getting the message out to the public. It is definitely a case that I hope will be solved in the near future.
To that point, every year we put something out at the anniversary, keep it in the public's eye. Something like this, you have no bodies, you have no truck, you have no hard physical evidence from the actual event when they disappeared. So keeping it out in the public's eye, not letting it get wasted away in the travels of time, even now, I'm still in touch with my old buddies back in FBI planning, hey, we need to keep this in the public view come next February. And the office has been great. And sure enough, they got to do it. So that's how it'll get solved, if ever.
Yeah, so next February will be the 20th anniversary.
It will. Yep. 20 years.
Wow. Hi, it's Jerry. I wanted to let you know that Vito is prominently featured in a new podcast, There and Gone South Street, where he reviews the disappearance of Richard Petrone and Daniel Imbo. There's a link for There and Gone in your podcast app's description of this episode and the episode show notes. You just mentioned that you retired last year. What are you doing now?
Well, my wife is a Cuban girl from Miami. So she was up next to my crazy family up in the New Jersey, New York area for the last 26 plus years. So her turn, we moved down here to Southeast Florida, and I started a PI business and then jumped on an opportunity with a company down here doing cybersecurity, which a lot of people would find funny because a few years ago I could barely sign on to a computer. I'm employed by Restaurant Brands International down here in Miami, enjoying the heck out of it. Good bunch of folks I'm working with, and the job is pretty damn interesting.
Well, I want to thank you and Chris. Thank you so much for coming on to FBI Retired Case File Review to tell us your stories and to review the bank robbery takeover case. As I mentioned to Chris, I like to give my guest the last word. So, Vito, what would you like to say?
I always tell people I'm one of the luckiest people in the world because not many people can say from the beginning to the end that literally there wasn't a day that I looked at the clock waiting to go home. Matter of fact, I used to have to force myself to go home because the mission of the Bureau of Law Enforcement in general, but especially of the Bureau, the quality of people, the amount of fun and the stories that you have, because on a violent crime squad, you could imagine you get in some harrowing situations and you got each other's backs. But in saying that, the experiences of those events and working together with some folks that you had to trust with your life just left me with some of the best memories in the world. If I could have done another 20 years in the Bureau, if they would have let me, they had that mandatory retirement, they kick you out, I would have stayed another 20 years. Absolutely loved it. Anybody thinking of a career in law enforcement, you will never meet a better group of people.
And that's the end of the interview. In your podcast app's description of this episode, you'll find a link to the show notes at jerrywilliams.com, where you'll find a photo of Vito Roselli, links to articles and court documents about the bank robbery conspiracy, and case-related images. There's also a link to other FBI Retired Case File Review episodes about bank robbery cases, and a link to the new podcast, There and Gone South Street. I hope you enjoyed the interview and that you'll share it with your friends, family, and associates. You can show me just how much you liked it by buying me a coffee. There's a link in your podcast app's description of this episode, or you can visit jerrywilliams.com and tap on the little coffee cup icon in the bottom right-hand corner of my website. Don't forget to follow FBI Retired Case File Review on your favorite podcast app. Now, this podcast is all about true crime, but if you're also interested in crime fiction, once a month via my reader team email, I keep you up to date on the FBI and books, TV, and movies. When you join my reader team, you get access to my FBI reading resource, a colorful list of more than 70 books about the FBI written by FBI agents who have been guests on this podcast. There's nonfiction, crime fiction, true crime, and memoirs. You'll also get my FBI reality checklist where I debunk 20 cliches about the FBI and receive news about what I'm up to and about my FBI nonfiction and crime fiction books. I want to thank you for listening to the very end. I hope you come back for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.